The alpha of the most feared army in the kingdom crouched in the dirt, not for a warrior, not for a noble, but for a broken Omega that her own pack had left to die. He looked at the trembling dog standing over her shattered body, growling at an army with bleeding gums and absolutely nothing left to lose. Then he looked at her. Nobody had looked at Mel like that in 10 years. Not through her. Not past her. Not with the cold calculation of a man deciding what she was worth. He looked at her like leaving her there was the one thing he absolutely would not do. Mel didn't understand it. She was the cursed Omega. The dead weight. The girl her own pack had tied to the warden's post and walked away from without a single backward glance, offered to the enemy like a coin tossed at a debt. She had survived 10 years of bloodbind injections, branding irons, and silence. She did not expect to survive this. But Alpha Draven had already made his decision. And somewhere deep inside Mel's locked and lightless chest, her wolf ember, silent for a decade, let out one single piercing sound. Mate. Thank you for sticking around with me, my wonderful story family. If you are already hooked in on today's story and ready to enjoy it, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. We like to know our pack members from all over the world. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. Mel woke to pain so complete it had its own heartbeat. Every breath was a negotiation, a shallow, careful thing that required her full concentration, because anything deeper sent white fire tearing through her ribs and reminded her exactly how close she was to the edge of something she couldn't come back from. The ceiling above her was canvas. The ground beneath her was packed earth covered in rough wool. Not a bed. Not even close to a bed. The kind of place you stored things that had no proper home. She was exactly where she had always been. Nowhere. Max was pressed against her side, his head resting on her hip, one good eye fixed on the tent entrance like a soldier at his post. When Mel stirred, his tail struck the ground once, a single, deliberate thump that somehow contained more loyalty than anything any human being had ever offered her. She tried to sit up. The pain detonated. It ripped through her chest so completely that her lungs locked and her vision widened out, and for several long, suffocating seconds, she couldn't breathe at all. Just lay there with her mouth open and the tent spinning and her body screaming at her that she had already used up every miracle available to her and she needed to stop asking for more. When the spasm passed, she lay still and stared at the canvas and forced herself to think. She belongs to the beast that saved her and to the master who owns him. Draven's words. She had been turning them over since consciousness returned, pressing them like a bruise to see how much they hurt. Max was a stray. Strays had no masters, which meant either the most powerful alpha in the Wolf Kingdom spoke in riddles, or he had claimed the dog and quietly swallowed her whole in the same breath. Neither possibility felt safe. Both possibilities made Ember shift in the locked chamber of her chest in a way that had nothing to do with fear. The tent flap opened. A woman stepped inside, tall, sharp-boned, with close-cropped hair and the expression of someone who found most situations mildly beneath her. She carried a clay bowl that steamed, and she moved through the space with the brisk efficiency of someone who had more important things to do and was choosing, generously, to do this one first. For ribs broken, she said, setting the bowl down without ceremony. I've set them. But if you breathe wrong, one will puncture your lung and you will drown before I can cross the tent. So breathe correctly. A pause. Healer Martha. Drink that. All of it. Why does he want me alive? Mel asked. Martha looked at her the way people look at someone asking a genuinely foolish question. That is his business. Yours is that bowl, those ribs, and controlling your animal before Warrior Brennan loses another finger. She nodded at Max, who had the expression of a dog with absolutely no remorse. Drink, she repeated, and left. Mel drank. It was the best thing she had tasted in 10 years, which was either a testament to Martha's cooking or a damning reflection of the decade behind her. 6 nights passed. She learned things in the slow, careful way of someone assembling a picture from pieces she wasn't sure she was allowed to have. The Iron-Blood Legion had claimed Ashenvale territory without a single notable battle. Lady Selene had surrendered within hours, which surprised no one who had ever watched her calculate odds. The 3 warriors who had tied Mel to the warden's post were now scrubbing Iron-Blood cookware in the rain. She told herself this brought her no satisfaction. She told herself that several times. Max never left her side. He ate when she ate, slept when she slept, and greeted anyone who came too close with a level of hostility that was deeply disproportionate to his size. He was healing. She was healing. And somewhere outside the supply tent, the camp shifted and reorganized around a new authority, one she could feel in the way every footstep outside hesitated slightly before passing her door. As though something invisible had been placed there. A warning. Don't. On the 6th night, with Max asleep and the camp quiet, Mel finally allowed herself to close her eyes without bracing for something terrible. That was when she heard it. Footsteps outside the tent. Heavy, deliberate, unhurried, not the paired rhythm of patrol, but a single person moving alone. They stopped directly outside the tent entrance and did not move again. Max lifted his head. His ears rotated forward. A low rumble built in his chest. Mel pressed her hand against him. Shoo. She waited. The tent flap did not open. Whoever stood on the other side remained there, 1 foot away, separated from her by nothing but a sheet of canvas. And the silence between them stretched so long and so taut that Mel's heart was slamming against her broken ribs by the time the footsteps finally retreated. Slow. Unhurried. The walk of a man who was not hiding. Just choosing. The scent hit her a moment later, slipping through the canvas seemed like it had been waiting for her to notice. Wood smoke. Cold earth. Something deep underneath with no name. Her breath stopped. He had been standing there the entire time. And Ember, silent for 10 years, locked behind a decade of poison and pain, pressed against the walls of her cage and whispered one word so clearly it could not be mistaken for anything else. Mate. Chapter 2. The word hung in the darkness like a lit match. Mate. Mel stopped breathing. Her hand was still pressed against Max's back, her fingers buried in his matted fur, and she lay completely motionless in the dark and told herself she had imagined it. That it was the pain. The blood-bind damage. 10 years of poison doing what poison does, rotting the parts of her that were supposed to work properly, making her hear things that weren't there, feel things that had no right to exist inside a body as broken as hers. She had not imagined it. Ember pressed against the walls of her chest again, faint, desperate, like a creature that had been locked in the dark for so long it had forgotten what light felt like and was now clawing toward the thinnest sliver of it with everything it had left. Mel pressed her fist against her sternum and pushed her down. No. The word formed somewhere savage and self-protective in the deepest part of her. Absolutely not. Because she knew what happened when Omegas believed things like this. She knew the exact shape of that particular destruction, had lived inside it, had worn its scars on her skin for 10 years. Alpha Vale had been her mate too. The moon goddess had chosen him for her too. And he had stood in front of his entire pack with cold eyes and a colder voice and severed that bond like it was an inconvenience he was tidying away. He had spent the following decade making sure she never forgot what she was. Nothing. She was nothing. And she would survive this the way she had survived everything else, by burying what she felt so deep that even she couldn't find it. She buried it. She lay in the dark with Max's warmth against her side and the ghost of wood smoke and cold earth still drifting through the canvas seam. And she closed her eyes and made herself breathe through it until her heartbeat slowed and Ember went quiet and the night felt like just a night again. She was very good at surviving. It was the only thing she had never failed at. 2 weeks passed. Healer Martha cleared her for light work with the brisk efficiency of a woman issuing a military order, and Mel moved through the camp like a shadow, careful, quiet, occupying as little space as possible. The herb garden behind the medical tent became her world. Rosemary. Sage. The smell of turned soil and Max drowsing in the pale morning light beside her like a small, ugly guardian. She focused on the work. She focused on breathing correctly. She focused on anything that wasn't the fact that she felt Draven before she ever saw him, his scent reaching her across the camp like a hand closing gently around her throat. He never spoke to her directly, but he was always there. At the training ground when she crossed it for water. Near the weapon racks when she passed with firewood. At the edge of her peripheral vision with the quiet, deliberate presence of a man who was choosing exactly how close to stand and finding a reason every time to choose closer. Ember noticed every single time. Mel ignored her every single time. She was managing. She was surviving. She was fine. Then Kayla stepped into the herb garden and the air changed completely. She came alone, which was the first warning. Kayla never came alone unless the damage she intended was meant only for one person. She stopped at the garden's edge with a smile that had all the warmth of a blade catching sunlight, her eyes moving over Mel with the slow, deliberate assessment of a woman cataloging exactly where to strike. "The whole camp is talking about you," Kayla said softly. Mel kept her hands in the soil. "Head down. Make yourself small." She had worn this particular posture for so many years it had become part of her skeleton. "My mother says you won't last the month." Kayla crouched to her eye level, close enough that Mel could see the calculation running behind those pretty eyes, cold and precise and completely without mercy. "I think she's being generous. Men like Draven don't keep broken things, Mel. They examine them. They find them interesting for a moment." Her voice dropped to something almost gentle, which was always the most dangerous register. "And then they remember what they are." Max rose from the dirt. The ridge of fur along his spine lifted slowly, ridge by ridge, like a wave building before it breaks. "He'll discard you," Kayla continued, straightening, smoothing her dress with the unhurried ease of a woman who had never once in her life felt genuinely threatened. "And when he does, there won't be a single wolf in this territory willing to look at you. Not even that pathetic animal." She left. Mel stayed on her knees in the garden for a long time after the footsteps faded. Her hands were trembling in the soil. Her chest was doing something complicated and painful that had nothing to do with her ribs. She pressed her dirty palms flat against her thighs and stared at the lavender until the burning behind her eyes receded enough to breathe through. Max pressed his entire weight against her leg. She put her hand on his head and held on. She returned to the supply tent at dusk, barely holding herself together, and stopped dead in the entrance. Something sat on her blanket. A small clay jar sealed with wax. And beside it, a strip of dried meat placed with the deliberateness of something left on purpose, not dropped, not forgotten, placed. Mel crossed the tent on legs that had gone completely still and picked up the jar. Broke the seal. The scent hit her like a hand pressed flat against her sternum. Healing salve. Not Martha's ration supply. Not the thin, watered-down version the lower ranks received. The real grade, rich and sharp and clean. The kind she had seen in only one tent in this entire camp, when she had cleaned it 3 days ago with her eyes down and her hands careful and her heart very firmly locked. Draven's tent. Her hands began to shake. He had seen Kayla come to the garden. He had watched every word of it, and instead of confronting it with spectacle and dominance the way every alpha she had ever known wielded their power, he had come here quietly, without witness, without expectation, and left medicine for her wound and food for her dog. Like they were worth taking care of. Like she was worth taking care of. The sound that built in Mel's chest was so sudden and so enormous that she had to press both hands over her mouth to hold it in, and even then her whole body shook with the effort of containing it. Her eyes burned. Her throat locked. 10 years of learning to feel nothing cracking open all at once around a jar of salve and a strip of dried meat on a threadbare blanket. Max pounced on the meat. His tail wagged so hard his entire back half swayed. And somewhere in the locked and lightless place inside her chest, Ember pressed against the walls and whispered his name. Outside the tent, slow and deliberate and unhurried, footsteps stopped, right outside the entrance. Again. Chapter 3. Mel did not move. She stood in the center of the tent with the jar of salve pressed against her chest and Max frozen beside her, his ears rotated forward, his tail no longer wagging. The footsteps outside had stopped with the particular stillness of something deliberate, not a patrol passing, not a warrior changing direction. Someone had walked to the entrance of her tent and chosen, very precisely, to stop there. The canvas didn't move. She waited. Her ribs ached with every shallow breath. The salve jar was warm from her hands. Outside, the camp had settled into its nighttime rhythms, distant fires, murmured voices, the low howl of a perimeter patrol sweeping the tree line, and underneath all of it, that presence. Solid. Unmoving. Close enough that if she reached through the canvas she could have touched him. She knew it was him. Her body knew before her mind finished forming the thought, that pull in her sternum, that warmth spreading through her chest without permission, Ember pressing toward the thin barrier of canvas with the desperation of someone reaching toward heat after years of cold. Then the footsteps retreated. Slow. Unhurried. The walk of a man who had made his decision and was at complete peace with it. Mel breathed for the first time in what felt like several minutes. Morning arrived brutal and gray, and with it came Draven. Not to her tent. To the camp's central ground where Mel was crossing with a bucket of water, and he was reviewing patrol formations with Brennan, and their eyes met across 30 feet of packed earth for exactly 3 seconds before he looked away. But those 3 seconds rewrote something in her chest so completely she nearly dropped the bucket. He said nothing. He always said nothing. But that evening there was a wool blanket on her sleeping mat, thicker than the one she had, folded with military precision, and Mel sat beside it for a long time without touching it. She thought about what Kayla had said. Men like Draven don't keep broken things. She thought about Alpha Vale, who had spoken about love right up until the moment he decided she was inconvenient. She thought about the bond snapping, that horrible clean sound inside her chest, like a dry branch breaking, and the relief that followed it. The relief of emptiness. How she had held onto that emptiness like a life rope ever since, because emptiness couldn't be used against her. She thought about all of it, and then she looked at the folded blanket and the empty jar she had already used and the strip of hide she'd found this morning beneath her water basin, laced into a crude bracelet sized exactly for her wrist. Stop, she told herself. Stop doing this. Ember said nothing, but she was smiling. Mel could feel it. 3 days later, they came for Max. Mel heard him first, that sharp, alarmed bark she had never heard from him before, escalating within seconds to something that made every hair on her body stand upright. She dropped the herb she was trimming and ran before she had decided to move, her healing ribs screaming, and rounded the corner of the medical tent to find him cornered in the narrow alley between the canvas wall and the barracks. 2 of Kayla's women stood over him. One held a wooden staff raised. Max was on the ground. His back leg bent at an angle that turned Mel's blood to ice. The staff came down. The sound Max made was something she would hear in her sleep for the rest of her life, bewildered, broken, the cry of a creature who had only ever offered loyalty and could not understand what it had done to deserve this. Something rose in Mel's chest that she had no clean name for. Not anger. She knew anger. She had swallowed it for 10 years. This was something older and colder and completely without ceiling. She crossed the distance before the woman could raise the staff again and ripped it from her hands. The crack of the wood against her palm was the loudest thing she had ever heard. And she did not drop it. Chapter 4. The alley went completely silent. The woman stared at Mel, at the staff in her hands, at the expression on her face, and took a step backward. Her companion went still. Neither of them had expected this. Nobody ever expected anything from Mel except silence and compliance, and for 10 years she had given them exactly that. Not today. You broke his leg. Her voice came from somewhere she didn't recognize. Low. Steady. Scraped clean of everything except the fact. She looked at Max on the ground, his back leg bent wrong, his body shaking, his one good eye fixed on her face with a trust so complete it split her open. He has never done anything to you. He has never done anything to anyone except protect me. And you broke his leg. It's just a dog, the woman stammered. It bit Farah last week and he is under the Alpha's protection. The words dropped like stones. So am I. The second woman glanced past Mel's shoulder, a fast, guilty dart of the eyes, and Mel didn't need to turn around to understand what it meant. She had already seen her. A third figure standing in the shadow at the alley's mouth, far enough back to claim distance, close enough to have orchestrated every moment of this. Kayla. Watching. Always watching. Never touching anything with her own hands. Mel looked at her directly. Across the gap, across the evidence of what she had ordered done, across 10 years of everything that had passed between them. Next time, Mel said quietly, send yourself. Kayla's expression didn't crack. But something shifted beneath it, a tightening around the eyes, a stillness that was not composure, but its convincing imitation, and then she turned and walked away, and her women followed. And Mel was alone in the alley with a broken dog and a staff she was gripping so hard her knuckles had gone white. She dropped it, knelt in the dirt, gathered Max as gently as her shaking arms would allow. He whimpered when she lifted him, a small, terrible sound, and pressed his face against her neck and stayed there, trusting her completely with the pain he couldn't understand. She stood with him against her chest and her healing ribs screaming and walked to the medical tent without stopping. Healer Martha took one look at Mel's face and cleared her table without a word. 2 clean fractures in the back left leg. She said it the way she said everything, with the brisk efficiency of someone who had decided long ago that information delivered cleanly caused less damage than information wrapped in softness. She splinted the bone with thin strips of wood and bound it tight, and Max endured every second of it with a stoic patience that made Mel's chest hurt in ways that had nothing to do with her ribs. She held his head in her lap the entire time. She whispered things that meant nothing, good boy, you're okay, I've got you, and told herself the words were for him. They were not for him. Who did this? Martha asked without looking up from her work. Kayla's people. Martha's hands didn't pause, but her jaw tightened, a small, controlled movement that on any other face would have been a shout. She finished the last binding, checked the tension, sat back. The Alpha will hear about this before nightfall. No. The word came out before Mel had finished thinking it. Martha looked up. Her eyebrows climbed toward her hairline. No, Mel said again, and the steadiness in her own voice surprised her enough that she had to pause and confirm it was real. It was. Something had settled in her chest in that alley, not courage exactly, not yet, but the cold and absolute understanding that waiting for someone else to handle Kayla had a 10-year track record of producing nothing. I will handle it. Martha studied her for a long moment. Something moved through her clinical eyes, brief, warm, quickly controlled. The leg will heal in a full moon cycle if he stays off it. I'll make him a brace. She paused. Be careful. Kayla is not her mother. She's cleverer. She won't come at you directly, she'll use the structures around you and make whatever happens look like your fault. Mel looked down at Max. His one good eye was half closed, his breathing steadier, his tail giving the faintest possible wag against the table when her fingers found the spot behind his torn ear. He had stood between her and an army. She could stand between him and one woman. She waited until the camp went dark. Kayla's tent was lit from within, a warm amber glow through the canvas, and Mel stood outside it for 3 long breaths before she pulled back the flap and stepped inside without announcing herself. Kayla sat on her sleeping furs with a bronze mirror in one hand and a brush in the other, dragging it through her dark hair with the unhurried ease of a woman who believed nothing in the world would dare interrupt her. She looked up, and for one fractured, unguarded second before the mask slammed back into place, Mel saw it. Fear. Genuine fear. The most powerful woman in the former Ashenvale hierarchy was afraid of her, afraid of a cursed Omega with dirty hands and a splinted dog and 10 years of nothing to lose. Mel stepped fully inside and let the flap fall closed behind her. "You and I," she said quietly, "need to end this tonight." But before a single word left Kayla's mouth, a shadow passed across the outside of the tent canvas, slow, deliberate, unmistakable. Someone was standing outside. Someone who had followed her here. Chapter 5. Mel didn't look at the shadow. She kept her eyes on Kayla, on the fear that had flickered behind those careful eyes before the mask rebuilt itself, brick by brick, into something cold and composed and dangerous. Because fear in a woman like Kayla was not a weakness. It was a warning. Cornered things bit hardest, and Kayla had spent her entire life learning exactly where to sink her teeth. "You walked into my tent uninvited," Kayla said. Her voice was measured. Controlled. The brush had stopped moving through her hair, but she hadn't put it down, was holding it the way a person holds something familiar when the world tilts sideways. "That alone is an offense I could bring before." "You broke my dog's leg," Mel said. The simplicity of it landed harder than an accusation. Kayla blinked. "You didn't do it yourself. You never do anything yourself, but you sent those women into that alley and you stood in the shadows and you watched." Mel took one step closer. She was trembling. She could feel it in her hands, in her knees, in the breath moving through her damaged ribs. But her voice didn't shake, and she had learned long ago that the voice was the only part that mattered. "I know what you're building. The alliance with the elders. The whispers about witchcraft. The campaign to position yourself beside Draven while you bury me quietly enough that nobody notices." Something moved across Kayla's face. Quick and sharp and gone. "You've been busy," she said softly. "I've been paying attention." Mel held her gaze. "I'm not your enemy. I don't want your position or your mother's influence or anything in this camp except to be left alone. But if you touch my dog again," her voice dropped to something so quiet it barely disturbed the air between them, "I won't go to Draven. I won't go to Brennan or any warrior assigned to watch over me. I will come back to this tent, and I will tell every single wolf in this pack what you did to my dog out loud, in front of everyone, and let them decide what the alpha's promise of protection is actually worth." The silence that followed was the most dangerous kind, not empty, but loaded. Packed tight with everything Kayla was calculating behind those dark eyes. Her grip on the brush tightened. A muscle in her jaw flickered. Then, very carefully, she set the brush down. "You've changed," Kayla said. Not a compliment. An assessment. The kind a general makes when the terrain shifts unexpectedly. "Yes," Mel said simply. She turned and walked out. Her legs gave way 3 tents away. She found a stack of supply crates in the dark and pressed her back against the wood and slid to the ground and shook great, crashing tremors that rattled her teeth and made her healing ribs throb and reminded every inch of her body that she was still the same girl who had been tied to a stone pillar 2 weeks ago with nothing and no one. But the shadow was still out there. She had felt it shift when she left the tent, felt it pull back into the dark with the practiced silence of someone who had spent years learning to exist without being detected. She had not looked. She had kept walking, kept her spine straight, kept her steps even, and waited until the crates before she let herself fall apart. She pressed her face into her knees and breathed through it. In. Out. The camp was quiet around her, indifferent, and the night air was cold enough to sting, and somewhere in the medical tent Max was sleeping with his broken leg propped on a folded cloth and his nose tucked under his tail. She had done that. She had walked into Kayla's tent with nothing but her voice and walked back out again. "There you are," Ember whispered. Soft. Wondering. Like she was meeting someone she had been waiting a long time to find. "There you finally are, Mel." Mel lifted her face from her knees. And found him. Draven stood 6 feet away in the space between 2 barracks, arms folded, his back against the timber wall. The nearest torch was far enough that his face lived in shadow, but his eyes caught the light. Silver green. Steady. Fixed entirely on her with an expression she had never seen on any alpha's face in her life. Not possession. Not pity. Pride. You followed me, she said. I was already there, he said quietly. I wanted to see what you would do. Her breath caught. You let me face her alone. He was silent for one long, devastating moment. I watched you not need me. His voice was low and rough at the edges, and full of something vast that he hadn't yet found words for. That is not the same thing. He took one step toward her, just one, and the bond between them pulled so sharply that Mel pressed her hand flat against her own chest to keep herself from swaying. I need to tell you something, he said. Something I should have said the night I stood outside your tent and couldn't make myself go in. The torch light shifted. His jaw tightened. There are people in this camp who are going to try to destroy you before I get the chance to say it. He looked at her, directly, completely, the way he had looked at her in the border clearing when the world was ending and she was certain nobody would ever look at her like that again. And I am running out of time. Chapter 6. Running out of time, Mel repeated slowly. What does that mean? Draven was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to have weight. The torch at the end of the alley guttered in the night wind, throwing restless shadows across the hard planes of his face, and Mel watched something move behind his silver-green eyes, something vast and carefully restrained, like a tide pressing against a wall it had decided, for now, not to break through. Kayla is building a formal case, he said. A political claim. She intends to present it at the next moon gathering before the full pack, positioning herself as my chosen mate while painting you as the reason I haven't agreed. His jaw tightened. Her mother is involved. The elders are listening. And as long as you are sleeping in a supply tent on the wrong side of this camp, you are exposed in ways I cannot fully control from a distance. Mel stared at him. What are you saying? I am saying, Draven said, with the careful precision of a man who had rehearsed this and was now discovering that rehearsal had not prepared him at all, that I want you in my tent. Under my roof. Where I can place myself between you and anything that comes through that door. A pause. The muscle in his jaw flickered once. Even if what comes through that door is something I cannot fight with a blade. He stepped closer. Not the calculated step of a commander closing distance for emphasis, something rawer than that. Something that came from a place underneath the armor. I would lay down my life before I let anything touch you. His voice dropped to something that was barely above a murmur and hit harder than anything he had said at full volume. I need you to understand that. Not as your alpha. Not as the man whose camp you are living in. His silver-green eyes held hers without flinching, without performing, without the careful management she had come to associate with every word he spoke in front of other people. As the man who has not slept a full night since the moment your scent found me at that border and rewrote everything I thought I knew about myself. The confession landed between them like something breakable. Mel could not speak. She was not sure she was breathing. Come stay in my tent, he said quietly. Let me protect you the way you deserve to be protected. Please. That last word, please, from a man who had never needed to ask for anything in his life, broke something open in her chest that she was fairly certain could not be repaired. All right, she whispered. She moved her things that same night. There was not much to move. Draven's tent was larger than she expected and more austere than she had imagined. A war table, a weapons rack lined with blades arranged with military precision, a sleeping platform covered in dark fur. No excess. No decoration. Just the clean, spare space of a man who had spent 15 years being stripped of everything that wasn't essential. A second sleeping mat had been placed on the opposite side of the tent, already made up with fresh linen, positioned with the deliberateness of a decision made well before he had asked her tonight. He had already known what he was going to say. That realization sat warm and dangerous in the center of her chest. Max inspected every corner of the tent with his nose, circled Draven's sleeping fur 3 times with the critical air of a property assessor, and collapsed onto it with a groan of absolute satisfaction. His splinted legs stuck straight out. His tail wagged without apology. Max, Mel hissed. Draven looked at the dog. Said nothing. But something shifted at the corner of his mouth, barely visible, gone almost before it arrived, and Mel filed it away with everything else she had quietly been collecting about him. Every fragment. Every crack in the armor. She was building a picture she had no business building, and she knew it, and she could not stop. She settled onto her mat and tried to sleep. She did not sleep. The tent breathed around her in the dark, and Draven was 8 feet away on the other side of it, and the bond between them was a living thing in the enclosed space, warm and insistent and completely, mercilessly impossible to ignore. Every time she shifted, the linen carried the faint edge of wood smoke and cold earth. Every time the wind pressed the canvas walls inward, the scent deepened, and ember moved inside her chest like a flame someone had finally stopped trying to extinguish. Mel stared at the ceiling and thought about his mouth. The hard, unsmiling line of it in front of his warriors. The almost softness of it when he looked at Max when he thought no one was watching. She thought about what it would feel like to close the 8 feet between them in this dark, to press her mouth to his and find out if he kissed the way he did everything else, with that devastating, deliberate control that somehow made every small gesture feel enormous. She thought about his hands. What they would feel like against her jaw, against her body, the curve of her waist. She thought about the weight of his body over hers, solid and warm and careful, and what it would mean to be held, truly held, by someone whose arms had never once been raised to hurt her. She thought about it until her skin burned with it. Then she stopped herself. He is doing you a favor. The thought arrived cold and clarifying. You are a political problem he is managing. A complication he is solving. And you are lying in the dark building fantasies about a man who commands armies and has never once needed anything, certainly not a cursed, broken Omega who has nothing to offer him except 10 years of damage. She pressed her eyes shut, pulled the linen tight around herself. Across the tent, Draven lay completely still. The silence stretched long and dense and threaded through with everything neither of them was saying. Max snored softly between them on the stolen fur. Outside, the camp had gone fully quiet. There was nothing left to listen to except the dark and the wind and the sound of her own heartbeat refusing to slow down. Then, Mel. His voice in the darkness was different from any version of it she had heard before. No command in it. No strategy. Stripped completely bare, rough at every edge, like something he had been holding back for a long time and had simply run out of the strength to keep holding. She said nothing. Her heart was a fist against her ribs. I know you're not sleeping. A breath. Slow and deliberate and not quite steady. Neither can I. The words that followed came out low and raw and full of something so unguarded it made her chest ache. Not when you are this close to me. Not when I can hear you breathe and smell your scent in every corner of this tent and feel the bond pulling at me so hard I can barely remember why I am still lying here instead of crossing the room. Mel stopped breathing entirely. I think about you, he continued, his voice dropping even lower until it was barely sound at all, just vibration, just warmth moving through the dark toward her. More than I have ever allowed myself to think about anything that wasn't war. I think about what it would mean to show you what you are worth. To make you feel things that Manvale convinced you that you could never feel. A long pause. I want that. I want to be the one who gives you that. But I will not take a single step toward you until you come to me first. Until every part of you is certain. You have had enough things decided for you without your permission. The confession sat in the air between them, enormous and irreversible. Mel pressed both hands flat against her chest and felt her own heartbeat slamming back at her, wild and terrified and desperately, traitorously, achingly alive. Draven, her voice cracked on the single word. Not tonight, he said softly. But soon, Mel. I am running out of ways to be patient." The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. And then, cutting through it like a blade through canvas, cold and deliberate and clearly meant to carry, Lady Celine's voice, just beyond the tent wall. "The gathering is in 3 days. Make sure the elders are ready." A pause, sharp as a whip crack. "The Omega does not leave that gathering with her standing intact. One way or another, we end this there." Chapter 7. Mel stopped breathing. Not from the bond. Not from Draven's confession still burning through every nerve ending in her body. But from the cold, deliberate clarity of Lady Celine's voice on the other side of that canvas wall, measured and unhurried and utterly certain. The way a woman speaks when she has already decided the outcome and is merely informing the universe of its instructions. The Omega does not leave that gathering with her standing intact. The tent was silent for exactly 2 seconds. Then Draven was on his feet. He moved the way she had seen him move in the border clearing, without hesitation, without wasted motion, every inch of him shifting from stillness to absolute purpose in the space between one breath and the next. He was at the tent entrance before Mel had fully processed what she was seeing, and he pulled back the canvas flap with a control so precise it made no sound at all. Lady Celine stood 3 feet away in the dark. She was not alone. A figure beside her, one of the elder council members, gray-haired and wide-eyed, went rigid the moment Draven's silhouette filled the entrance. The silence that followed was the particular silence of people who have just realized they miscalculated the distance between themselves and something dangerous. Lady Celine, to her credit, did not flinch. "Alpha Draven." Her voice was smooth, composed. The voice of a woman who had spent decades surviving powerful men by never letting them see her sweat. "You were simply threatening the life of a woman under my protection," Draven said, "outside my tent at night, in front of a witness." He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. The quiet of it was worse than shouting, the way deep water is worse than rapids. "I want you to think very carefully about your next sentence, Lady Celine. Because whatever you say in the next 10 seconds will determine what tomorrow looks like for you." The elder beside her made a small, involuntary sound and took a step backward. Lady Celine's composure held, but only just. Mel could see it from inside the tent, the barely perceptible tightening around her eyes, the single breath she took that was slightly too controlled to be natural. "The gathering is a tradition," she said carefully. "My daughter has every right." "Your daughter's rights end," Draven said, "where my mate begins." The word dropped into the night air like a stone into a well. "Mate." Mel's hand flew to her mouth. Lady Celine's composure finally, visibly cracked. It was small, a widening of the eyes, a fractional parting of the lips, but on a face that controlled as hers, it was enormous. The elder beside her made no attempt to disguise his shock, stepping back another full pace as though distance from the conversation might protect him from its consequences. "If your daughter presents her claim at the gathering," Draven continued, his voice carrying the absolute, undecorated finality of a man closing a door, "she will do so knowing it is already too late. And if anything happens to Mel before, during, or after that gathering, I will hold you personally responsible. Not Kayla. Not the elders. You." A pause so sharp it had edges. "Do we understand each other?" Lady Celine said nothing, but she dipped her chin, a microscopic, furious inclination that was the closest a woman like her could come to a retreat without calling it one. Draven let the canvas fall. He turned back into the tent, and Mel saw it then, the thing he never showed anyone, the thing that lived underneath the armor and the authority and the 15 years of being built into something that couldn't be touched. His jaw was set. His hands, hanging at his sides, were not quite still. And his eyes, when they found hers across the dark tent, were silver-green and blazing and completely, devastatingly unguarded. "You said mate," Mel whispered. He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes, you said it out loud. In front of her." I know what I said. Draven. Her voice cracked straight down the middle. If she didn't have a reason to destroy me before, she won't touch you. He crossed the tent in 4 strides and crouched in front of her sleeping mat so that they were level, so close she could feel the warmth radiating off him, could see the pulse beating at the side of his throat, could smell the wood smoke and cold earth of him so clearly it made Ember surge so hard against her ribs that Mel gasped. I will not let her touch you. I will not let anyone touch you. His voice was fierce and quiet and absolute. Not while I am breathing. Mel looked at him. At the face that had looked at her in the border clearing like she was worth seeing. At the hands that braided leather collars and left salve on blankets without signatures. At the eyes that had just said mate to the most dangerous woman in the former Ashenvale hierarchy without a moment of hesitation. Why? She whispered. The same question. The one she kept asking because his answers kept dismantling her. Why would you do that for me? Draven reached out and touched her face, just his fingertips, featherlight against her jaw, and the bond ignited so completely that the air between them seemed to vibrate with it. Because you are not something I am doing a favor for, he said roughly. You are something I would burn this entire territory down to keep safe. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, and his eyes never left hers, and his voice dropped to barely nothing. And I think some part of you already knows that. Mel's breath was completely gone. His forehead dropped toward hers, inch by slow, deliberate inch, and the distance between them was nothing, was everything, was the single most suspended moment of her entire life. And then Max, with the catastrophic timing that had apparently become his defining contribution to her existence, let out a sharp, alarmed bark. Not a sleepy sound. Not a dream bark. The bark of a dog who had heard something outside that he recognized. And did not like. Chapter 8. Draven pulled back. Not far, just enough. His hand left her face, and the cold that rushed in to fill the space was so immediate and so cruel that Mel almost reached for him without thinking. Almost. She pressed her hands flat against the sleeping mat instead and forced air into her lungs while every nerve ending in her body mourned the distance. Max was on his feet, splinted leg forgotten, his entire body aimed at the tent entrance like a loaded arrow. Draven was already at the weapons rack, his hand closed around the blade at the end of the row without looking, the practiced reach of a man whose body knew exactly where every weapon lived. He turned to Mel, and the transformation was breathtaking and terrible at once. One moment the man who had been a single breath from her mouth, the next something ancient and cold and completely without mercy. Stay here, he said. Draven. Stay. Not a command. A plea wrapped in iron. He slipped through the entrance without a sound. Mel sat in the dark with Max rigid against her leg and her heart slamming against her ribs and the ghost of Draven's fingertips still burning along her jaw like the memory of something she hadn't known she was starving for until it was taken away. She pressed her fingers against the exact place he had touched. Held them there. Breathed. He called you his mate, Ember whispered. Out loud. Without hesitation. In front of Lady Selene. Stop, Mel told her. He said he would burn this territory down to keep you safe. Stop, he said. I know what he said. The words tore through her with a force that surprised even her. I know exactly what he said. And I know what happens to women like me when they believe words like that. She had believed words like that once before. She had felt a bond like this once before, warm and pulling and achingly real, and she had followed it all the way to Alpha Vale's feet, where it had been severed so cleanly and so publicly that she had heard herself scream from somewhere outside her own body. She had carried that sound in her chest for 10 years like a stone she couldn't put down. She would not survive dropping it again. Draven returned 6 minutes later. One look at his face, and every thought in Mel's head went quiet. What was it? She asked. Tracks outside the tent. His voice was controlled. Tight. The way a fist is tight around something it doesn't intend to release. Someone was stationed here long before Selene arrived. Not one of my warriors. His eyes found hers. "Mel, they were here while we were talking. While I said what I said." The silence that followed had weight. Physical weight, pressing down on her chest from the inside. "Kayla knows," Mel said. "Someone does." He crossed to the war table and stood with both hands braced against the surface, his back to her, his head dropped forward. The lamplight threw the landscape of his shoulders into sharp relief, the breadth of them, the tension running through them, the scar below his left shoulder blade that she had memorized without meaning to, which means the gathering in 3 days is no longer a political maneuver. It is a trap. And we are already inside it. Neither of them slept. Mel lay on her mat in the half-dark watching Draven work at the war table, and the intimacy of it undid her in ways she hadn't expected. Not the almost kiss, not the confession in the dark this. The private version of him. The furrow between his brows when something didn't resolve. The slow flex of his jaw when he was thinking through something difficult. The way he reached up and pressed 2 fingers against his temple, just once, in a gesture so human and unguarded that it hit her somewhere behind the sternum with a force completely disproportionate to the gesture itself. She thought about crossing the 4 feet of space between them. She thought about pressing her hands flat against his back, between his shoulder blades, and feeling the tension there. She thought about what he would do, whether he would go still, whether he would turn, whether those careful hands would find her the way they had earlier, deliberate and devastating and unbearably gentle. She thought about his mouth. What it would feel like to finally close the distance she had been holding herself back from since the border clearing. Whether he kissed the way he did everything else, with that complete, consuming focus, as though nothing else in the world existed while he was doing it. Her skin was warm just from thinking about it. "Then stop thinking and go to him," Ember said, with the bluntness of a creature who had run out of patience for self-inflicted suffering. "He is doing me a favor," Mel thought back. The cold water thought. The survival thought. "He is managing a problem. I am a complication in his camp, and he is too honorable to leave me exposed, and that is all this is." Ember went silent. But she made a sound first, low, frustrated, the sound of a wolf who had lived inside this woman for long enough to know exactly how comprehensively she was lying to herself. Dawn came gray and sharp, and with it came Brennan. He ducked inside without ceremony, took one look at the scene, Mel on her mat, hollow-eyed, Draven at the table, unslept, the particular charged silence of a space that had contained something enormous and was still vibrating with it. And said nothing about any of it. He set a folded piece of hide on the table and stood back. "It is worse than we thought," he said simply. Draven looked up. "Kayla met with all 6 elders last night. Not 4, all 6. Brennan's jaw was set. "She has a new angle. She is telling them the bond is constructed. That you invented it to justify keeping the Omega close. That a true alpha would never allow a she-wolf of this rank to compromise his judgment." His eyes cut briefly to Mel, then back. "She is calling it an obsession. She is telling them that you are compromised. That the man who stood at the border and built a legend out of 15 years of blood is being undone by a cursed Omega and a stray dog." The words hit the room like stones dropped into still water. Mel felt each one land. "She is also," Brennan paused. Something in his face shifted. A tightening that on Brennan's face, which rarely moved for anything, meant the next words were going to be very bad. "She is circulating a new rumor. Not witchcraft this time." He looked directly at Mel, and for the first time since she had known him, something in his eyes looked almost like fear for her. "She is saying the Omega is already broken beyond saving. That the bloodbind damage is too deep. That Ember will never return, which means the bond cannot be completed, which means under Lycan law. It can be dissolved," Draven said. His voice was absolutely flat. 3 of the elders are already entertaining the argument," Brennan said. The silence that followed was the worst one yet. Mel sat very still on her sleeping mat with her hands folded in her lap and her chest completely hollow, and the cold water thought echoing through her. "You are a complication. You are a problem. You are a broken thing that cannot be fixed." And she did not cry because she had trained herself out of crying long ago, but her throat closed and her eyes burned, and she pressed her lips together hard against whatever sound wanted to come out. Then Draven moved. He came to her in 4 strides and dropped to his knees on the ground directly in front of her sleeping mat, so that they were level, so close she could see the muscle jumping in his jaw, could see the silver green of his eyes blazing with something so fierce and so raw it stole every coherent thought from her head. He took both her hands in his. "Look at me," he said. She looked at him. "Ember is not gone." His voice was rough and certain and absolute. "She is right there. I can feel her every time I am within 10 feet of you. I can feel her reaching for my wolf the same way he reaches for her every single moment of every day that I spend not touching you." His grip on her hands tightened, not hard enough to hurt, just enough to anchor. "Kayla can tell the elders whatever she wants. She can build whatever case she wants. She cannot dissolve what the moon goddess put in place, and she cannot touch you." His jaw tightened. "Not while I am Draven." Brennan's voice cut through the tent like a blade. Something in his tone made both of them go still. He was standing at the tent entrance, the piece of hide in his hand, his face ashen in a way that Mel had not thought Brennan's face was capable of being. "I haven't told you the worst part yet," he said. He held out the hide. On it, in rough urgent letters, were words that turned Mel's blood to ice. They poisoned her food. And below it, in a different hand, shakier, written as though whoever wrote it barely had time. "She has been ingesting concentrated bloodbind for 6 days. By the night of the gathering, Ember will not just be caged. She will be dead." Chapter 9. The hide fell from Brennan's hand. Nobody moved to pick it up. Mel sat on the sleeping mat and read the words again, not because she hadn't understood them the first time, but because her mind kept sliding off them the way feet slide off ice, unable to find purchase on something so enormous and so final. 6 days. Concentrated bloodbind in her food for 6 days. She thought about every meal she had eaten in this camp, every bowl Martha had handed her, every portion from the kitchen, every small and ordinary act of survival that had apparently been quietly, methodically killing the one part of her that had survived everything else. Ember. She reached inward instinctively, the way she had reached inward every day for 10 years, feeling for the faint warmth of her wolf the way you feel for a pulse in something you are terrified has stopped. And Ember was there. But different. Smaller than yesterday. Dimmer. The way a candle is different from a fire, the same flame, but with so little left to burn on that the dark around it had become enormous. "I'm here," Ember whispered. She sounded exhausted. She sounded like someone saying goodbye. "No," Mel said out loud. The word came out cracked and strange, and nothing like a word at all. "No, no, no. Mel. She's fading." Mel pressed both hands flat against her chest, against the place where Ember lived, as though she could physically hold her in. "Draven, she's already, I can feel her getting she's. Look at me." Draven was in front of her, his hands gripping her face, his silver-green eyes blazing with a ferocity so consuming that it cut through the panic like a blade through smoke. "Look at me. Right here. Stay with me." She looked at him. Her eyes burned. Her throat had closed so completely around the grief rising in it that she could barely breathe. "I have you," he said. "I have both of you. Do you understand me? I am not going to let her die." "You can't," her voice broke. Snapped clean in half. "You can't stop this. If she goes, if the bond can't complete because she's Draven, 10 years of bloodbind already took so much of her, and now she couldn't finish." The words dissolved into something wordless and terrible that she had been holding behind her teeth for 10 years and had never once let out. Draven pulled her into his chest. Not gently. Not carefully. With the full force of a man who had decided there was no measured response to this, who had spent 15 years learning to be a weapon, and was now using every ounce of that ferocity as a shield around her instead. His arms wrapped around her completely, one hand at the back of her head pressing her face into his neck, and the warmth of him, and the solidity of him, and the scent of him, wood smoke and cold earth, and something that was just him, flooded through her so completely that Ember surged one sudden, desperate time against her ribs like a drowning creature breaking the surface. Mel broke open. The sound that came out of her was not crying. It was older than crying. It was 10 years of whips and brands and bloodbine needles and floors she had slept on and meals she had gone without and the face of every person who had looked at her and decided she was nothing. It was all of it, coming out at once, in great shaking waves that she had no control over and no walls left to stop. Draven held her through all of it. He did not tell her to stop. He did not tell her it was fine. He pressed his lips to the top of her head and kept them there and held her so completely that there was no part of her the dark could reach without going through him first. Find out who put it in her food, he said quietly over her head to Brennan. His voice was a different thing now, stripped of warmth, stripped of everything, down to something cold and absolutely terminal. Find out tonight. I want a name before sunrise. Brennan left without a word. Healer Martha arrived within the hour. Brennan had gone to her directly, and she came in with her medical bag already open and her face arranged in the particular expression Mel had learned to read. The one that meant the situation was serious and Martha was deciding how much truth would help and how much would simply cause damage. She examined Mel in silence, checked her pulse, her eyes, pressed careful fingers along her jaw and throat, asked her questions in a low, clinical voice while her hands moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had seen a great many terrible things and intended to address this one the same way she addressed all the others. Then she sat back. And the expression on her face was not the careful neutral one. It was something Mel had never seen there before. Fear. How long? Draven asked from where he stood at Martha's shoulder, his arms folded, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the healer with an intensity that made the lamplight feel insufficient. At the current concentration, Martha stopped. Started again. If she continues consuming it, Ember will be unresponsive within 48 hours. After that, she pressed her lips together. After that, even if we remove the source, the damage may be irreversible. The tent went absolutely silent. 48 hours, Draven repeated. The gathering is in 2 days, Martha said. Nobody said what that meant. They didn't need to. The architecture of it was already clear. Kayla had timed it perfectly. By the night of the gathering, when Draven attempted to declare the bond publicly, Ember would be gone. And without Ember, there was no bond to declare. Without the bond, Mel was nothing. An Omega with no wolf, no standing, no claim, and Kayla standing in the center of the clearing in her white dress with her 6 elders and her political case, and nothing standing in her way. It was not a plan. It was execution. Is there an antidote? Draven asked. Martha was quiet for 1 second too long. There is a compound. Moonveil extract combined with silver ash root. It can counter the bloodbind accumulation if administered in time. She met Draven's eyes. The ingredients are rare. I have the Moonveil in my stores. The silver ash root, she paused. The only supply within reach is in the Thornwood. 3 hours east. In rogue territory. The words fell into the tent and stayed there. Rogue territory. 3 hours east. In the dark with the gathering 2 days away and Kayla's spies already threading through every corner of the camp. I'll go, Draven said immediately. You cannot go, Brennan said from the entrance. He had returned silently, the way Brennan did everything, and the look on his face told Mel the news he carried was not good. If you leave this camp tonight, you trigger the Elder Clause. An alpha who abandons his territory in a time of political contest forfeits his right to. I know the clause. Then you know you cannot go. Brennan's voice was not gentle. It was the voice of a man delivering a truth he wished he didn't have to deliver. If you leave, Kayla wins by default. The elders will convene without you. By the time you return, there will be nothing left to return to. The silence stretched. Mel watched Draven's jaw work. Watched the calculation happening behind his eyes, the rapid, brutal triage of a man weighing the unweighable. His territory against her wolf. His alpha standing against Ember's life. Her. Against everything. Send Garrick, Draven said. Garrick left this morning for the southern border. You sent him yourself. He won't be back until. Then I'll go alone, Mel said. Every head in the tent turned. She was on her feet. She didn't remember standing. Her legs were unsteady beneath her and her chest ached, and somewhere deep inside, Ember flickered like a flame in a high wind, but she was standing, and her voice when it came out did not shake. I know the Thornwood, she said. I spent 2 years forging its edges for Lady Celine's kitchens before the bloodbind made it too dangerous to send me far. She met Draven's eyes. I know where the silver ash root grows. I can be there and back before dawn. Absolutely not, Draven said. It is my wolf. It is your life. It is the same thing. The words tore out of her with a force that surprised them both. Ember is not separate from me. She is not a thing I carry around. She is the part of me that survived every single thing that was done to me, the part of me that kept whispering, hold on, hold on, hold on through 10 years of needles and brands and floors and silence. Her voice cracked straight down the middle and she didn't stop. If she dies, I don't survive it. Not really. So yes, it is my life. And it is mine to risk. Draven stared at her. For a long moment he didn't move, just stood in the lamplight with the ferocity in his eyes doing battle with something enormous and anguished underneath it. His chest rose and fell. His jaw tightened until a muscle leaped in it. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the border clearing, like she was the only thing in his field of vision. Like everything else had ceased to matter. Then he crossed the tent, cupped her face in both his hands, and kissed her. Not the almost kiss of before. Not the breath-away closeness that had been interrupted twice now. This was real and complete and devastating, his mouth against hers, warm and certain and full of everything he had been containing since the border clearing, every gift left without a note, and every night stood outside her tent, and every word said in the dark. All of it, pouring through the point of contact between them like water through a broken dam. Mel's hands flew to his chest. She gripped the fabric there and held on and kissed him back with the whole force of everything she had been burying, everything she had been telling herself she didn't feel, everything Ember had been whispering for weeks. And the bond between them ignited so completely that the air in the tent seemed to shimmer with it. When he pulled back, his forehead dropped to hers, his breathing uneven for the first time she had ever witnessed. You come back to me, he said. His voice was wrecked. Do you hear me? Whatever you find in that forest, whatever comes at you in the dark, you come back to me. Tears spilled down Mel's face. She didn't stop them. I will send Warrior Sable to the tree line, he said. He will wait for you at the border. If you are not back by dawn, his hands tightened on her face, I am coming in after you. Elder Claws or no Elder Claws. She nodded against his forehead. He let her go. The cold that replaced his hands was the loneliest thing she had ever felt. She took the map Martha pressed into her hands. She took the small blade Draven placed at her hip without asking, just buckled it there himself, his hands efficient and his eyes on her face the entire time. She crouched and held Max's face in her palms while he whined and licked her nose and looked at her with his one good eye like he knew exactly what was happening and wanted her to understand that he objected strenuously. I'll be back, she told him. I promise. She stood. She walked to the tent entrance. She pushed the canvas aside. Mel. She stopped. Turned. Draven stood in the center of the tent, the lamplight behind him, Max pressed against his leg. And he looked at her the same way he had looked at her every single time, the way that had no calculation in it and no strategy and nothing except the raw, unguarded truth of a man who had spent 15 years building walls and had dismantled every single one of them for her. I love you, he said quietly. Simply. Like it was not the most enormous thing he had ever said in his life. I need you to know that before you walk into that dark. Whatever happens. You know. The world went completely still. Mel stood in the entrance of his tent with the night at her back, and those words filling every hollow place inside her that 10 years of cruelty had carved out, and for one long, breathless moment she simply existed in them. Let them be real. Let herself believe them. I know, she whispered. She walked into the dark. And somewhere behind her, a sound broke the silence of the camp, low and sharp and unmistakable. A wolf's howl. Short. Strangled. Cut off immediately, the sound of a man silencing his wolf by force, with everything he had. Mel pressed her hand against her chest and kept walking. And inside her, flickering and dim and desperately, stubbornly alive. Ember howled back. Chapter 10. The thornwood was nothing like she remembered. In the years she had forged its edges for Lady Celine's kitchens, it had been merely dark, the ordinary dark of a forest at night, full of rustling and shadows and the small, indifferent sounds of things living their lives. Tonight it was something else entirely. The trees pressed close on both sides of the narrow path, their ash-gray trunks swallowed by the dark above her head, and the silence was the particular silence of a place that was aware of her. Watchful. Deciding. Mel kept moving. The map Martha had pressed into her hands was rough but precise, a healer's map, marked not with roads and borders, but with the locations of things that grew and where they grew and what they needed to survive. Silver ash root preferred the northern edges of the thornwood, where the soil ran cold and damp along the base of the rock formations. 3 hours east, Martha had said. Mel was making it in 2, because fear was a remarkable accelerant and Ember's dimming warmth in her chest was a more powerful motivator than anything she had ever known. She did not let herself think about the kiss. She tried not to. She failed comprehensively. It was there every time she blinked, his mouth against hers, certain and consuming, the way his hands had held her face like she was something precious and breakable and absolutely worth the handling. The way his voice had sounded when he said, "I love you." Not performing. Not strategizing. Just saying it. The way you say something when you have been holding it so long that putting it down is the only option left. "He loves you," Ember whispered. Fainter than before. But there. I know, Mel thought back. Stay with me. Please stay with me. Ember didn't answer. But she didn't go quiet either, and Mel held on to that with everything she had. She found the silver ash root 40 minutes into the thornwood. It grew in a dense cluster along the base of a moss-covered rock shelf exactly where Martha's map said it would be, pale silver stems catching what little moonlight filtered through the canopy, unmistakable, almost luminous in the dark. Mel dropped to her knees in the cold soil and harvested with hands that shook and eyes that burned and the kind of focused desperation that leaves no room for anything except the task directly in front of you. She was tying the bundle when she heard the footstep behind her. Not an animal. Too deliberate. Too measured. She was on her feet with Draven's blade in her hand before the figure stepped out of the trees, and she had exactly 1 second of pure, white, annihilating terror before the torchlight caught the face. "Warrior Sable. The Alpha sent me in," he said. His voice was completely flat, the way it always was, but his eyes moved over her with a rapid, assessing sweep, checking for injury the way Draven had taught his warriors to check, first and immediately, before anything else. "You were taking too long." "I found it," she said. She held up the bundle. Something shifted in Sable's expression. Not a smile. She had never seen Sable smile, but a release of something held very tightly. "Then let's move." They ran. Dawn was breaking at the treeline when Ashenvale came back into view, the camp's torches burning low in the gray pre-morning light, the timber barracks pale and solid against the sky. Mel saw the tent from 200 feet away. She saw him before that. Draven was standing at the camp's eastern edge, at the exact point where the treeline met the territory boundary, exactly where he had told her he would not be unless she failed to return by dawn. His arms were folded. His jaw was set. He was looking directly at the spot where the path emerged from the forest, and he had clearly been looking at that spot for some time. Max was beside him, splinted leg and all, sitting at his feet with his nose pointed toward the trees, his tail absolutely still, his entire small body radiating the concentrated anxiety of a creature running entirely on love and refusal to accept bad outcomes. Mel broke into a run. She didn't decide to. Her body simply moved, toward the light, toward the warmth, toward the man and the dog standing at the edge of the dark waiting for her to come home. The bundle of silver ash root was clutched in both hands, and her healing ribs were screaming, and she did not care about any of it. Draven met her halfway. He covered the distance between them in 4 strides, and then his arms were around her, both of them, iron and warmth and the complete, consuming solidity of him, lifting her off the ground entirely, pressing her against his chest so completely that she could feel his heartbeat slamming against her through the layers between them. Fast. Unsteady. Nothing like the measured drum she had pressed her palm against in the dark of his tent. He had been terrified. "I told you, Dawn," she said into his neck. Her voice was muffled and wet and not remotely steady. "You were gone too long." His voice was rough, fractured at every edge. His arms tightened around her. 2 minutes more and the elder claws could have burned to the ground. She laughed. It came out half a sob. "You would have burned your entire standing for me." Without a second thought. He set her down but didn't let go, kept his arms around her, his forehead dropping to hers, his silver-green eyes finding hers in the gray morning light with an expression so open and unguarded that it made her chest ache. Without half a thought. Without any thought at all. Max hit them both at knee height with the full force of his 30 pounds, tail thrashing, making a sound that was somewhere between a bark and a wail, the sound of a dog who had been holding himself together through sheer willpower and had now run out of willpower entirely. Mel reached down and gathered him with one arm without breaking contact with Draven. The 3 of them stood at the edge of the thornwood in the breaking dawn, and for a moment, one long, complete, extraordinary moment, nothing else existed. Healer Martha administered the antidote within the hour. She worked in silence, combining the silver ash root with the moonveil extract she had prepared through the night, producing a compound so potent the smell of it made Mel's eyes water. She drank it without hesitation, all of it, every bitter, burning drop. And then she sat on the medical tent's examination table with Martha's hand against her wrist, checking her pulse, and Draven standing 6 inches away, watching her face with the focused intensity of a man who had decided to watch for any sign of distress and respond to it immediately with whatever force was necessary. For 20 minutes, nothing happened. Then Ember moved. Not a whisper. Not a flicker. A surge, a wave of warmth so sudden and so complete that Mel gasped and pressed both hands against her chest and felt tears running down her face before she had fully processed why. Ember rose through 10 years of bloodbind residue and 6 days of concentrated poison like something that had always been larger than its cage, pressing outward into every corner of Mel's chest, flooding into her fingertips, her throat, the backs of her knees. Her whole body lit from the inside with a warmth she had not felt since before Alpha Vale's first needle. "There you are," Ember said. Full-voiced. Present. Herself. "There you finally are." Mel pressed her face into her hands and wept. Martha made a small sound, quickly suppressed, and found something urgent to examine on the other side of the tent. Draven crouched in front of her and took both her hands away from her face and held them in both of his and said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and he was wise enough to know it. He just held her hands and let her cry and kept his eyes on her face the whole time, steady, present, and full of something so warm and so complete that it made the crying worse and better simultaneously. "She's back," Mel managed. "I know," he said. "I can feel her." The gathering that night was not what Kayla had planned. It was not what anyone had planned. Draven stood in the center of the clearing in the full moon's light and declared the bond before Kayla had finished arranging herself at the clearing's center. No preamble. No strategy. Just his voice carrying across the assembled pack with the quiet, absolute certainty of a man stating a fact the universe had already decided, and he was simply relaying. Mel Archer is my true mate. Bonded by the moon goddess before I set foot in this territory. The bond is confirmed. It is complete. And it is not a subject for petition, politics, or elder council review. He turned and extended his hand toward the edge of the clearing. Mel walked forward. Max walked beside her. Collar gleaming. Crooked jaw set. Three-legged and entirely unbothered, with the quiet dignity of a creature who had known from the very beginning how the story ended. She took Draven's hand. The bond scent rolled through the clearing like a tide, warm, unmistakable, the signature of something so real and so ancient that every wolf present felt it in their bones before their minds had processed it. She heard the intake of breath move through the crowd in a wave. Heard the silence that followed it, not the tense silence of before, but the odd silence of witnesses. Kayla stood in her white dress with the silver beads in her hair and said nothing. For the first time in her life, she had nothing to say. Lady Celine, beside her, looked at the joined hands and the bonds scent filling the air and the expression on her daughter's face, and she took her daughter's arm and walked away. Quietly. Without drama. The retreat of a woman who understood, finally, that some things could not be outmaneuvered. The elders bowed. One by one, without being asked, they bowed. They were alone in the tent before the last torch in the clearing had finished burning. The camp had settled into its night sounds around them, distant laughter, the creak of timber barracks, the low murmur of warriors on patrol, and inside, the lamplight was warm and still, and the world outside felt very far away. Max had been delivered into healer Martha's care for the night. Her idea, offered without explanation, accompanied by an expression that suggested she had very limited patience for the alternative. Mel stood in the center of the tent and looked at Draven. He was looking back at her the way he always looked at her, like she was the only fixed point in his world, like everything else was peripheral and she was the center, like he was still faintly astonished that she was real and present and his. "Hi," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "Hi." She crossed the tent. She covered the space between them in 4 steps, the same 4 steps that had separated them since the night she moved in, the 4 steps she had lain awake measuring from her sleeping mat in the dark. And she placed both hands flat against his chest and looked up at him from a foot away and said simply, quietly, with everything she had, "I love you too." I should have said it before I walked into that forest. I should have said it every night I lay awake pretending I wasn't thinking about you. Her voice was steady and her eyes were clear and Ember was humming inside her chest like a song she had finally stopped trying to silence. "I love you. And I am not afraid of it anymore." Draven looked at her for one long, wordless moment. Then he kissed her. It was nothing like the first kiss, urgent and desperate and full of fear and the shadow of the thornwood at her back. This was unhurried, deliberate. The kiss of a man who had nowhere else to be and nothing else to want and intended to take his time with the most important thing he had ever been given. His hands came up to her face, both of them, cradling her jaw with that devastating gentleness, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones as though memorizing them, and he kissed her slowly, deeply, with such complete and consuming focus that Mel felt the world outside the tent simply ceased to exist. She kissed him back with everything, with the girl who had survived 10 years of floors and needles and silence, with the woman who had ripped a staff from a warrior's hands and faced Kayla alone in the dark and walked into the thornwood for her wolf, with every part of herself she had been told was broken and worthless and not worth keeping. She kissed him with all of it, and he received all of it, and his arms pulled her closer until there was no space left between them. He walked her backward until her knees met the sleeping platform, and then he stopped, pulled back just far enough to look at her face in the lamplight, his breathing unsteady, his eyes silver green and blazing and entirely devoted. "You are so beautiful," he said roughly. "I need you to know that. I need it to be the last thing you hear tonight before anything else." Mel's eyes filled. She blinked it back. "Tell me again," she whispered. "Beautiful," he said, pressing his lips to her forehead. "Extraordinary." To her temple. "Mine." To the corner of her jaw, her cheekbone, the bridge of her nose, each word its own sentence, its own declaration, delivered against her skin so that she felt every syllable. "The most remarkable thing I have ever seen in my life. And I have been looking for you since before I knew you existed." They came together in the lamplight with the gentleness of two people who understood the weight of what they were holding. He laid her down on the dark fur, his fur, their fur now, and looked at her like she was something sacred, like the act of being allowed to touch her was a privilege he intended to spend the rest of his life honoring. His hands moved over her with the same deliberate, unhurried care that he brought to everything, slow and certain and completely attentive, learning the landscape of her like a map he intended to memorize, finding the places that made her breath catch and returning to them with patient, devastating focus. He pressed his lips to the scar on her wrist, Celine's brand, and held them there for a long moment, and the tenderness of it broke something open in Mel's chest that she suspected had needed breaking for a very long time. "Every scar," he said quietly against her skin, "is a place you survived. I will not look at a single one of them with anything except reverence." She pulled him up to her mouth and kissed him with a fierceness that surprised them both. What followed was unhurried and consuming and entirely theirs, two people who had spent too long carrying damage alone finally setting it down in the same place, at the same time, in the warmth of each other. He gave her his complete attention the way he gave everything his complete attention, thoroughly, without distraction, without any part of him present anywhere else in the world. He made her feel, in the most profound and physical sense, exactly what he had promised her in the dark when she couldn't sleep. Things she had not believed she could feel. Not once did he rush. Not once did his hands move with anything except the most exquisite, maddening care. He watched her face through all of it, reading every expression with the focused attention of a man who had decided that her responses were the only information that mattered. And when she finally said his name in the dark, it came out as something she had never heard from herself before. Something whole. Something unhurt. Something that sounded, startlingly, like a woman who believed she deserved to be exactly where she was. Afterward, he held her against his chest with one arm wrapped around her shoulders and his lips pressed to the top of her head and his heartbeat steady and slow beneath her palm. "Stay," he said. "I'm already here," she murmured. "I mean forever." The word dropped into the quiet of the tent without preamble or ceremony, just simply, the way Draven said everything that mattered. "Stay here. In this tent. In this territory. In my life." His arm tightened around her. "Be here when I wake up tomorrow. And the day after. And every day after that until there are no more days." Mel lay against his chest and listened to his heart and felt Ember humming inside her, warm and full and present, and thought about the warden's post. About the rope and the drums and the cold blank faces of men who had weighed her life and found it lighter than their fear. She thought about the border clearing and a 30-pound dog with a bleeding jaw who had not weighed anything at all. She thought about gifts left without notes and a collar braided by hands more accustomed to weapons and a man who had stood outside her tent in the dark and chosen, every single time, to stay. She pressed her palm flat against his chest. Felt his heartbeat. Counted it. Real. 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 "Yes," she said. Max returned in the morning. Healer Martha delivered him personally, which Mel suspected was as close to a wedding gift as Martha was capable of producing. He burst through the tent entrance with the energy of a dog who had been separated from his people for 8 hours and had strong feelings about it, launched himself onto the sleeping fur, turned 3 circles, sneezed directly on Draven's leg, and collapsed between them with a groan of profound satisfaction. His tail wagged. His one good eye found Mel's face. She scratched behind his torn ear. He groaned again and pressed closer. Draven looked at the dog, then at Mel. then at the ceiling of his tent with the expression of a man who had made his peace with certain things. "He is going to do this forever," Draven said. "Yes," Mel agreed. "He is going to be between us every single night for the rest of our lives." "Almost certainly." A pause. "I would not change it," Draven said quietly. Not to Mel. Not to Max. To himself. To the tent and the morning and the life that had arranged itself around a broken girl and an ugly dog and a man who had spent 15 years becoming a weapon and was only now, finally, learning what he actually was. Mel looked at him, at the profile she had memorized in lamplight and half-dark and the gray of early morning, at the scar below his left shoulder blade and the tattoo above his chest, and the hands resting on the fur that had braided a collar and left medicine on blankets and cupped her face like she was something worth the handling. "Neither would I," she said. The morning light filled the tent. Outside, the camp woke around them, fires lit, voices rising, the ordinary extraordinary sound of a world that did not know and did not need to know what had happened inside these canvas walls. What had been found here? What had been returned to the people it had always belonged to? Ember was humming. Max was snoring. And Mel lay in the warmth of everything she had survived to reach, in the arms of the man who had looked at her in the worst moment of her life and decided she was worth seeing, and for the first time in 10 years, she did not brace for what came next. She simply let it come. This story was made for every person who has ever been told they were too broken to be loved. You are not. You never were. Thank you for staying until the end. Please subscribe, leave a comment telling me where in the world you watched this from, and share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. I'll see you in the next story.